So at any point in time, I could be collecting, research and intel on customers simply by opening the office door. I'd love to say, every 5 years I sat down and I, answered that standard, interview question of where do you want to be in 5 years? And there was a deliberate, and purposeful plan in place. We knew that if we didn't launch this program at a certain point of time, we would miss that whole development planning cycle that ANZ goes through, which means we would almost have to wait another 12 months before we had the opportunity to launch again. Start with the customer, find out the problem that you're trying to solve, and then work out how to monetize it.
Welcome to Not the Rob Bell Podcast, where we talk with business owners, marketers, and professionals to extract what makes people and businesses successful.
Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Not the Rob Bell Podcast. Today's guest, I've got Kate Young. She's Senior Manager for Customer Centricity and Capability at ANZ. We talk all things fostering change in a large corporation and how customers should be at the centre of everything we do. It's coming up now. So, Kate Young, I've got you here. Thank you so much for your time on the podcast today.
Thanks very much for having me, Rob.
It's really, really great to see you. And no doubt you're doing this with a little bit of a different perspective to what you might if we weren't in the middle of COVID.
Yes.
So currently, your current role is Senior Manager of Customer Centricity and Capability at ANZ Bank, who no doubt everyone in Australia and probably half of the world is familiar with. But before we get to your current role, I'd really like to learn about Kate Young and sort of where your journey started. And I have it on pretty good authority that you may have stolen your neighbour's roses to sell them when you were a girl. So,
yeah, okay. So, yeah, it is on good authority. As kids, we were really always interested in, ways to make money and thinking about things through sort of an entrepreneur's lens. And, we're always really interested in thinking through that. And I'm not sure if it was because of the work ethic that our parents sort of instilled in us, as kids, and the value of hard work from a values perspective, or whether it was driven by independence or a combination of both. But yeah, we would be off doing lots of things, baking cookies, selling them to the neighbours, probably without really knowing what we were doing, did actually pick our neighbours' prize-winning roses and sold those. And I can actually remember...
We'll say borrowed.
Borrowed. They went to good homes. I can remember my mother and our friend's mother who lived next door actually making us go around the neighbourhood and return the money that we had made by selling those flowers. So we did get in a lot of trouble for that, but we were always thinking about new and creative ways to make some money. And actually probably my first job was when I was either 10 or 11, quite young, a morning paper round, 6 mornings a week, 5:30 a.m. starts. And I'm from Melbourne. So, Melbourne winters, 5:30 a.m. you're usually sort of dealing with 0 or 1 degree. So it was a hard slog for $3 a day. But I did it for a number of years and enjoyed components of it, maybe the fitness side, not necessarily the early starts.
When you're 10, the fitness is sort of just an added bonus, right? Because we're all active. Yeah. But how did that instill, that work ethic from such a young age? Did that come from your parents down, and was that guided, or was it just something that was in you from that point?
I think a bit of both. I probably enjoyed work and sought work at an earlier age than my sister did, but certainly our parents, from a values perspective, really encouraged us to work hard and to see the value of working hard. So regardless of what job we had, they always made sure that we saw the importance of giving it 100% and trying to do our best because, opportunities lead to opportunities. So I think it was a combination of, the environment that I grew up with and my parents' values, but equally just the desire to have, independence as well. I think I recognised at an early age that if I was making my own money, I maybe didn't have to do all those chores around the house for extra pocket money. So that might have also contributed to it.
And so obviously you came through and did a degree and things post high school and all the rest. Was there ever a time before you got to that point where you thought that maybe the academic side wasn't so important and maybe you just wanted to keep making a buck?
Yes and no. I actually started my degree in catering and hotel management. I actually thought that that was going to be my path, working in big hotels. I think I probably perceived it as quite glamorous at the time. I was working for a large hotel chain part-time while I was studying. I soon realized that wasn't my calling, that wasn't my passion. And what I was passionate about was the customer. And that obviously led me to change my degree sort of midway into a Bachelor of Business in Marketing. So I don't necessarily think that I was less interested in academia. I just think I wasn't really sure exactly what my passion and my calling was at that point.
And so you started down the hospitality route, and I know that you started as marketing manager for Accor at some point. Was that an internal transition that helped foster that, or was it a deliberate change?
No, it was really funny. Actually, after university, I took a gap year, went off and did some traveling, really trying to work out, what I wanted to do with my life, and came back pretty broke. Spent most of my money over there. What wasn't working was just traveling, and actually took a job in finance with Accor. So I did my first official job was as a debt collector, so collecting debt for the hotel. I did that for about a year. I liked components of it. I liked the fact that it was quite a methodical, kind of process-driven job. I liked the idea of ticking things off a list and tasks being finished. But again, it wasn't my true calling. So I actually transferred from that role into the marketing role with Accor.
And so obviously that started on what's become a very profound career in the marketing sector across a few different industries. I know a few years after that, you became marketing manager for Westfield, which is quite a prominent and diverse corporation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. It was a great job, and it was a great way to transition into a new sector, into a new industry. So obviously working in retail and property management, so it gave me a really good insight into those worlds. It was a tough gig. That business is pretty hard, or it was at that point in time. The model looks pretty different today. This was sort of before the surge of online shopping and the demand from customers around that. So it was pretty much the traditional bricks and mortar setup. But what was great about that from a marketing perspective was actually being able to see your customer. So at any point in time, I could be collecting research and intel on customers simply by opening the office door, walking around the shopping centre, seeing how people navigate the centre, what bags are they carrying, what times of the day, all of those types of things. So it was a really interesting role, a really fun role. We got to do a lot of great stuff. And it was just great from a customer perspective, and being able to bring those insights back to the organisation to help them make better decisions for customers.
And so then there's a transition there to marketing leader in GE Capital. What sort of fostered that shift from retail and property management to finance?
I think I just came to realise that I wasn't really wedded to one particular industry or the other. And the role came up, and it was actually managing some of the largest. So GE was at the time the underwriter or the financier behind some of the biggest retail credit cards. So if you're thinking about the Coles group of credit cards, Myer, Harvey Norman, and I was actually brought on to lead those books for GE. And so it was kind of a nice segue out of Westfield and purest bricks and mortar retail into a different side of the business, and thinking about the role that financial services can play to actually help retail businesses grow. So it just felt like a natural transition into a new industry, but also leveraging some of the expertise that I had acquired at Westfield.
It's probably quite an interesting evolution, and like the retail experience coming into the finance side, but in such a prominent retail capacity, because this is also what is behind essentially, majority of interest-free terms and things that you see broadly advertised in Harvey Norman and that sort of thing. Obviously changing a little bit with buy now, pay later schemes and some of the newer disruptive players. But, how much of what was different about that role where you're marketing to, I'm actually making an assumption there. Are you marketing to the retailer in that aspect, or are you marketing to the direct customer, or is it a bit of both?
It's a little bit of both. So, if I was to describe it, I'd say it would be a B2B2C model. So, our first customer was the retailer, and we had an obligation to them. There was a partnership in place, and there was obviously, obligations and commitments around what our role is in helping them grow their business. But then there was also the expertise that we brought to the table around, how can we help them understand their customers more through data? So that was probably the biggest difference between the roles I'd been doing with Accor and Westfield, where I could, as I said, open the door of the office and see my customer, to now understanding the customer through a different lens. And that was an analytical and data-driven lens. So we were very much about providing, insights, to our partners, really to help them make sure that we were delivering the right solutions to the end customer. So it was a bit of both.
Is there any unique challenges that really stand out there when you are operating in as you say, a B2B2C space where it's sort of an indirect connection to the customer as opposed to when you were at Westfield?
Yeah, look, I think probably the biggest challenge would come from potentially conflicting priorities, between the two different organisations. So that's, quite an obvious one in terms of how do we make sure that we are delivering what both partnerships need out of the relationship, but also making sure that we are therefore prioritising the best things for the customer as well. So that would probably be, I think, the biggest challenge, within that model.
Certainly some interesting challenges there. And so you took a few different roles with GE and then ultimately moved through. I could probably put words in your mouth, but you could summarise it better, how you've got from GE to ANZ currently?
Yeah, look, I'd love to tell you it was all really deliberate, Rob. I'd love to say, every 5 years I sat down and I, answered that standard, interview question of where do you want to be in 5 years? And there was a deliberate, and purposeful plan in place. That's actually not the case. If I really was to reflect on the pathway that's got me to where I am now, I would actually probably put it down to the complete opposite of that plan. I'd put it down to, an element of luck to some extent, synchronicity to some extent, and probably more so being open-minded and being open to new opportunities. Sometimes I think if you've got a really rigid plan in place, it means that sometimes you might miss the opportunity that is going to lead to the big thing. But look, I just took a number of different roles. I was always, and still am, really, interested in learning, growth and development, which has probably led me to the role I have today at the bank around capability. And so when I was working at GE, I was very much a consumer marketer. An opportunity came up to move into the commercial side of the business and to manage our distribution finance business, which is basically floor plan finance, sort of cash flow management, and also our fleet businesses. So that was a really great opportunity for me to, again, bring some of the expertise that I had gained in the consumer business, bring that into the commercial business, learn new industries, and really start to build skills in B2B marketing, which then led me to an opportunity at AIA Insurance, life insurance, and then an opportunity going back to my roots, credit card and personal lending marketing at ANZ. And then about a year and a half ago, the role that I currently have, which is around customer-centricity capability building, which was actually a newly created role at the bank. So I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to apply and be successful for that role. And it's been a terrific journey so far and a real privilege to have that responsibility within the bank.
That's awesome. I want to come back to that role in a second, but I think the way that you have a perspective on your professional development over time is interesting, and how it's a little bit element of luck, a little bit, and not being sort of locked into a specific plan or being open to opportunity. And how important do you think it is for professionals to be open to new things and unexpected opportunities?
I think now more than ever, extremely important. I think we are facing into, a rapid rate of change that we can't even imagine. And I think that the way roles look, if I was to think about marketing and I'm thinking about this at the moment, what does the future marketing function look like in the next 3, 5, 10 years? If you were really to lock yourself into a plan around the type of role you might want in 5 years, or exactly the steps that you need to take between now and then, I'm not sure that that's going to be as effective as it potentially was 10, 15, even 20 years ago. I think that the makeup of organisations, the model, the way we work is fundamentally changing. And there's talk of this concept of, a Hollywood model, which is, if you think about the way films are recruited for and made in Hollywood, the best producers and directors come together, they have their A-list. The A-list is usually invited to pitch for the role. There's talk in the future that some corporations to some extent might start to bring in that type of model and actually ask, potential candidates to pitch for large-scale projects. So I think that an open-mindedness around, the type of role you might have or the type of role that you could have, you just need to be a little bit more flexible than perhaps you did in the past.
So it's a really interesting perspective on, say, this Hollywood approach where it's very project-driven. And do you see that within larger organisations where you can bring teams together to work on, drive specific outcomes?
Yeah, I think so. And I think ANZ's, really pioneering that from a corporate perspective. You might be aware the Australian business within ANZ about 2 years ago moved to a large-scale agile transformation. And really that was exactly what you're talking about. The objective was to bring together cross-functional, purposeful teams that are actually working on specific projects. And the intent was really about efficiency and effectiveness, recognising that, the traditional waterfall model in large corporations like ANZ means that it can reduce speed to market. So that transformation was really about doing that exact thing.
And an interesting remark there is, or interesting phrase that you just dropped there was speed to market. And I think when we consider large corporations, we think around real slow operations and it's very entrenched and, very just traditional behaviour. There are some examples that you can share where that hasn't been the case in order to compete with, say, an upstart that can move very quickly?
Look, I think, as I said, that transformation that ANZ made a couple of years ago was really the bank trying to do that, recognising it was a pretty big ship that was quite static, quite hard to move and shift, and almost too big for its own good, if that makes sense. So it was really about making sure that there was greater transparency and visibility within the organisation to know who to connect with in order to get the job done quicker. So I think a lot of the changes it's made were very deliberate and very effective around reducing some of the challenges that it had faced into previously around being a bit slow.
And it's perhaps a little bit of a segue, but was there any, when you first joined ANZ and came, through different sizes of corporations, was there anything unexpected there in terms of how they do operate or how, business units are broken up or anything like that?
Look, it was probably a little bit more traditional than I had expected. I think coming out of some smaller businesses, they were a little bit more nimble in their approach. I found the bank quite traditional when I joined. I worked at the bank for about 12 months before we went through the transformation into scaled agile. So it was only a short sort of tenure before large-scale transformation was being made to enable us to work more effectively. But certainly it was a very traditional model and operating in quite a traditional way.
And so obviously that does tie into your current role where you are trying to really revolutionise and change what people are or what people within ANZ are doing. What are some of the things that are maybe entrenched in the company that you're really trying to pick off?
Well, the role that I have at the moment is really around helping ANZ be more customer-centric. So what that means in essence is that if we were to think about customer centricity on a maturity curve at the bottom end where it's totally irrelevant, to the top end where it's fully embedded, how are we helping our board and our executive committee make decisions that are truly customer-centric? And the way that we're doing that through the role that I have is actually by accelerating the capability of the marketing function. So we're basically looking at what are the current and the emerging capabilities that are required to be a modern-day commercially minded function. And as a result of that, marketing then can step up and play a much bigger leadership role than it has traditionally played within the bank, which then helps the board and the executive committee make those decisions that are truly customer-centric.
And so with this customer-centric role, which you have at the moment, was that something that was spawned from the Royal Commission, which we're all familiar happened in Australia recently?
I don't think directly, but I think it certainly played a role. I think the bank coming out of that period of time, recognised that it needed to be much more customer centric, that customers had a certain expectation of what they wanted from the bank. And I think a number of areas within the business were starting to think about how they could help the bank better respond to customer needs. And certainly our CMO took the responsibility to build this role within her function to really help address the requirements and the expectations that customers have around their relationship with the bank.
I think it's really admirable to see large companies making, really trying to challenge things and do and foster positive change. But obviously with a company the size of ANZ, where you have, you could probably tell me how many thousands of customers, where do you start with customer centricity when you have such a diverse client base?
I think for us it was about, first of all, recognising where we felt we sat as an organisation on that maturity curve, and then setting an ambition around, where could marketing shift the needle to in 1, 3, 5 years, and what are the programs that we need to put in place to actually help us do that. So, there's certainly a roadmap in place. You can't fundamentally transform from, one end of a maturity curve to the other, quickly. You have to set, some type of ambition and work through a prioritisation around what are the things that are really going to be the most meaningful and impactful for customers. And for us, that transformation of marketing to be really analysis and insight rich and very strategic around what it was doing, we felt was a really great place to start in order to make sure that what we were delivering to customers, whether by way of communication, services or experiences, was actually, delivering to meet their ever-changing needs.
And is there a challenge as well, such as COVID, which we're in the throes of right now, where customer needs change so dramatically and rapidly?
Look, absolutely. And I think no one expected the world that we're living in, at the moment. I think if I look at what the teams have done, and in particular the marketing function, their rapid response to alter the structure of how our products work, change fee structures, reduce rates, really help protect our customers and help them through this period, I think is really admirable. I think it's been a really great opportunity for the bank to rebuild some of the trust that perhaps we felt was missing coming out of the parliamentary inquiry. And I feel really, really proud of what the bank is doing, and in particular what our marketers are doing to really provide the best support possible for customers.
That's really cool. I'm curious to know, and I'm not sure whether we could go here or not, but when it comes to regular business and marketing, there's a very, there's the finance side and a product side, whatever that product may be, or a service. But in banking, finance is the product as well in a lot of ways. Is there ever a challenge where the finance side doesn't meet the marketing desire, or do you just treat it like a product like any other?
Well, I think the way we build and structure products is obviously to meet a customer need. So, we recognise in particular that, life stage events, for example, play a really critical role in terms of, the structure and makeup of the financial suite of products and services that a customer may need. So, for us, the customer, is at the heart of actually how we structure our products and services. If I was to think about somebody like Jeff Bezos, Amazon, for him, he finds it really confusing that people feel customer centricity or customer outcomes and needs are different to commercial outcomes. And for him, his mantra and what he talks to is always start with the customer, find out the problem that you're trying to solve, and then work out how to monetize it. So I think, for us in marketing, that's certainly, the approach that we like to take, which is let's start with actually building something that the customer wants, and then we can actually work out, the monetization or the commercial side of it. But the two are not incongruent. And I think that's actually probably the biggest shift that we're seeing banks and financial services providers go through is that shift away from thinking that the two are actually mutually exclusive.
It's an interesting perspective, and certainly starting with the customer and being part of that life cycle is certainly interesting. And when slight segue, but when you think around other aspects of competition for your products, such as the upstarts in the buy now, pay later sector and things like that, does that create new challenges for you guys in order to address those, or is it just a different market segment?
No, I think it does create challenges for us. I think it means that, the potential traditional model of banking might be changing. There are elements of it that might still remain and be static, but I think when you start to see these new emerging players, you have to recognise that if customers are utilising those, that there is a demand for it. And I think traditional players need to determine what space they want to play in, whether they want to actually compete or whether they want to actually carve out a different niche for them. And that's I think what most established organisations are probably doing, irrespective of what category they're operating in.
Because we've even seen very recently there was some capital raised for a totally digital mortgage startup. And this is typically a space where, we've become accustomed to small lending, buy now, pay later, zip pay, that kind of thing. But in a mortgage space, a lot of us still think at least a bank or a smaller entity which may already be owned by one of the larger banks. Does innovation in that space for very traditional products like mortgages, does that still start from a marketing and customer-centric focus, or does it come from somewhere else?
No, absolutely. It would come from, from marketing or certainly areas within the business that understand customer needs, market segments, and where there is opportunity to grow. So it would usually be cross-collaboration, but certainly marketing would be playing a very strong role in terms of, being the voice of the customer and helping to identify where those opportunities exist and what really is the underlying customer need that we're trying to solve for.
And when we look at, again, like competition in the market space, if we stick with mortgages for argument's sake, or even just traditional banking, there are so many sub-brands that are owned by one of the big four. Does that provide any challenges for marketing, or is it just like putting out different pairs of underwear?
But yeah, probably the latter. I think that most marketers understand brand strategy well enough to be able to work with a house of brands. And really it's just about, understanding, the brand strategy and which brands are serving for what segments in particular, so that you can actually, if there are, differences in the strategy, that you can recognise those and build those into your plans.
So if we think around working in such a large corporation now, are there aspects of your, very entrepreneurial roots as even a kid selling flowers and making cookies that really still play strongly in what you do now?
Yeah, look, I think to some extent. I think, and that's probably also, why I've gravitated towards, financial services, as an industry, but also marketing. I think, marketing is where, innovation is driven from. And so I think certainly the privilege that I find within my role is the opportunity to obviously, work with marketers, whether it's in the current role that I have today or in previous roles that I've had, to really try to drive, innovation through experiences, products, services, etc.
And so obviously you're trying to catalyse some change, which is explicitly what your role is around. Do you ever sort of hit a bit of a wall where, it's not received the way that you really hope that it would be?
It's a great question. Look, I think, the biggest part of my role is really around the fact that I play an enablement role. So what I'm trying to do is to build programs, infrastructure, etc., to actually help our divisional teams be more efficient and effective. So, if I was to sort of, it's almost a B to E model if I was to actually sort of classify it in that way. So, they're the customer. A large part of the role is making sure that, I'm not off in my own little world coming up with these fantastic ideas that I think will resonate. The majority of the remit is really around collaboration and engagement with the marketing leaders across our Australia, New Zealand and institutional businesses to make sure that what we're developing is actually meeting their needs.
And so is that where the capability program Marketing Masters comes into play? Is that
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Marketing Masters was launched back in October of last year. So as I mentioned, I took the role in January of 2019. So I've been in the role just shy of 18 months. And as I said, the brief was really around how do we help ANZ be more customer-centric by accelerating the capability of the marketing team. But more importantly, it wasn't just about ANZ being more customer-centric. It was also around making sure that we could provide the right support to help our marketers have a more fulfilling and sustainable long-term career at ANZ. So it was really about recognising the desire of the marketing function, to want to have a career with ANZ, but also to have a lot more transparency around what they needed to do to be awesome in their role today, but also what were the things they needed to do to achieve their career ambitions in the future. So we spent a bunch of time, going out and trying to identify what were the current and emerging capabilities that underpinned modern day commercial marketing teams. And we created a framework and a structure that basically detailed the critical capabilities that we believe existed across insights, strategy, design, and execution. But more importantly, from there, what we did to really address that strong feedback, from the marketing function around how do I grow? Help me with a pathway so that I know exactly what I need to do and that my efforts can be a little bit more deliberate from a learning and development perspective and translate into tangible value on the job, was actually to map every single marketing role within the organisation. So what that enabled us to do is to create a footprint for each role, so that our marketers could actually understand across those critical capabilities what was the expectation of their role. And by doing an assessment, to be able to understand where deviations, either positive or developmental, may exist. And that's enabled them through the program to identify one or two capability areas that they might like to focus on in the future. And it gives them a really, really targeted program around, different courses, different ways to build skill or different ways to build experience on the job that they can focus on that are going to help them, as I said, be better in the role they have today, or achieve the career growth they're wanting to in the future. So it's a great program.
It certainly sounds like a very powerful tool. How do you balance, say, really upskilling current team to, reap the benefits of that within the business, but also understanding that it may set them up to exit the business and take on another opportunity?
Well, I think our obligation, whilst they're employees, is to, help them have a fulfilling career. If it means that in time they decide, to exit the business and go elsewhere, we would obviously, be hoping that they would look back, very fondly at the opportunities that ANZ has been able to provide to them through the program to really help them on that pathway.
And obviously you yourself have moved within ANZ as well. Is that something that is really fostered with sort of an internal first approach, or is it just a case by case on a needs driven?
Yeah, I think it's a case by case basis. I mean, if we have the right talent within the organisation, of course, that's where we would look first. Certainly, if it doesn't exist and we feel that there's a requirement to acquire a different skill set, we would do that. But there's a pathway in place. So, we're always through the program, at the moment, we're looking at the existing capability framework and saying, even though it's only a year old, do we need to actually amend and adjust that? We're recognising that the rate of change that's going on in terms of customer expectations and market dynamics, competitive landscape, etc., is changing so rapidly that this framework is actually not static. This framework will need to continue to evolve and change, and therefore the programs that we put in place to ensure that we're ready when those changes do happen, that we've actually got the right programs to actually help upskill and reskill our teams to bring us on that journey. But from time to time, there might be a requirement to hire externally, certainly.
So you mentioned that it's a very fluid program. I'm not sure how familiar you are with other corporate programs of this nature, but do you feel that they can, while have the best intentions, be implemented in too much of a static structure and fail as a result?
Yeah, I think so. Deliberately or not, we took this program to market pretty quickly. So we established it and launched it within 9 months, which was pretty rapid for this scale of project and obviously launching it enterprise-wide and I guess the journey that we were on, we deliberately launched it as an MVP. So we said, you know what, we are not going to build this thing 100% correct and have it be the best it can be. What we are going to launch is this release, which is important to get people through the next 3 months, which is the development planning cycle. And then we are continually going to build and iterate and release new additions or new evolutions of the program to help it become bigger and better, but also to ensure that it remains relevant. So we've very much gone into this with sort of an MVP mindset, and that this program will be dynamic and that it will continue to morph and change as required.
I certainly think there's, we know from a startup mentality, it's a move fast, and if you're not embarrassed by your first product, then you waited too long. And was that really was some of those what drove that minimum viable execution as opposed to a more rounded launch?
Yeah, I think it was a number of factors. I mean, that certainly, but it was also the time that we had, to deliver this. We knew that if we didn't launch this program at a certain point of time, we would miss that whole development planning cycle that ANZ goes through, which means we would almost have to wait another 12 months before we had the opportunity to launch again. So it made sense for us to actually launch a smaller iteration of the program and then basically set a 2.0 strategy that said this is how we're going to evolve the program in the year that comes, so that when we launch or relaunch again for our next development planning cycle, we've actually been able to make adjustments and iterations, but also we've been able to capture the feedback of the teams around what's working and what's not working, so that we can obviously make the right decisions around what that evolution needs to look like.
And does that invested evolution also sort of increase their engagement in providing feedback for the program because it drives that evolution?
Yeah, I think so. And as I was mentioning earlier on, that collaboration, with all the senior leaders to make sure that what we're delivering is fit for purpose is critical to this program. So that approach absolutely gives us the opportunity to make sure that we're staying true to that. So we're already making adjustments. So some of what we launched, we know wasn't quite fit for purpose. We're already starting to make adjustments based on the feedback that we're receiving from the teams.
And so it's an important iterative process. Was there anything that stands out as unexpected as a consequence of that?
And I should know this as a marketer, but not everybody reads communications. So if you send emails, not everybody will read them. I think what we forgot is that actually what we delivered, whilst we tried to make it quite simple, is actually quite complex. So the journey that we went on probably gave us a false sense of the simplicity of the program. I think what was unexpected is that it was quite complex and some of the steps around what people needed to do was a little bit confusing. So we need to do a better job at that, basically moving forward and work out some different approaches to either simplify the program and make it a little bit more easier and ensure comprehension is better, but also to potentially change our comms strategy around how we drive that engagement.
It's interesting. And I think the unique perspective here is that you're engaging employees as customers of your product, and it's sort of but it's all a layer up. So we're actually coming up on time, but I do have a few simpler questions that I'd love to ask if I can. If there was a real key lesson that you could take away from your efforts in change management and trying to foster change in a large organisation, what would that be?
I think it would be not to try to be the smartest person in the room. I think that when you're trying to catalyse and drive large-scale change and transformation, the beauty of it is actually in surrounding yourself with people that are smarter than you, have different perspectives, can challenge, because that's really what is going to drive the innovation.
And how important is it to really truly listen to that feedback process and not just fall into a confirmation bias?
Oh, I think it's extremely important. I'm a talker, obviously. Listening to that, making sure that you're actually open to it and being conscious of it is something that I think we have to continually remind ourselves of, because you're right, it's very, very easy to fall into a different state of mind. And I think that if you are trying to drive large-scale change and transformation, you have to constantly be sense checking yourself with others and your peers, and ensuring that there is, honesty around that to make sure that all perspectives and feedback is heard.
And talking about honesty and accountability, how important is that sort of transparency and accountability when you are inviting feedback to know that any feedback is good feedback?
Look, extremely important. And it's really interesting, the work that I've been doing on capability. We've originally built out our framework that's focused on kind of technical capabilities. The more I do this role, the more I realise the real beauty comes in some of those shared soft or leadership skills. So making sure that if you are in a role like this that is, driving large-scale change and transformation, that you're really making sure that you're building your own capability around things like leadership or transparency, accountability, problem solving, that you're able to think critically. I think it's really important.
And so if you had to pinpoint a best and worst moment when you're trying to foster change management, what would that be?
A best moment is obviously when all your stakeholders are as passionate as you are about what you're doing, engaged, supportive. They're the best moments. The worst moments are when you fall back into the trap that we've just been talking about, where you've got a perceived outcome in mind and you're doing everything you can to move people to that position. It drives the wrong outcome.
It's certainly a bit of a challenge there. But I mean, as a marketer and someone who's aware of trying to foster change, is there a way that you can adapt to that scenario to maybe flip it into a positive?
Yes and no. I think you need to have a point of view and a perspective, but if you are trying to embed change and you are welcoming or asking for perspectives, you need to be ready to listen to them. So I think, as a thought leader, you need to have a point of view, you need to have a perspective, and you need to be able to back that up, but not at all costs. If there is a different perspective that perhaps you hadn't thought of, that could actually make the desired outcome better, you need to be able to do that as well. So it's a mix.
So there's a balance there between having a strong opinion and maybe knowing when you're wrong.
Don't tell my husband that. Yes.
No, secret's safe. This isn't going anywhere. So, Kate Young, we're almost out of time. Is there anything that you'd love for our listeners to understand about the work that you're doing, or anything with that regard? Yeah,
look, I think that the biggest thing that I'd like to leave with is just how critical it is at this point in time for people to be continuing to invest in their own personal growth and development. I think we can all get really, really busy with the stuff that we're doing, the work that we're doing. But I think when we are facing into, such large scale change, from an external perspective, now is the time to really be, investing in yourself, leveraging the resources that your organisation has, to really make sure that that you're at the forefront of what the new marketing might look like in the future.
It's certainly a bit of an upended thing that we've all found ourselves in since mid-March. Yeah. And while we're seeing some return to normality, it's certainly going to take a little bit of time. But Kate Young, I've really enjoyed this discussion, and thank you so much for your time. For anyone that wants to connect with you, is there somewhere that they can find a little bit more about you?
Yeah, absolutely. If you just search for me, Kate Young at ANZ Bank on LinkedIn, you'll find me, and my contact details are all listed there.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the discussion, and I look forward to talking again soon.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
Thank you, Kate.
There you have it. I hope you really enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please like it, share it, or leave us a review on your favourite platform. It helps us show more of this content to people just like you.